All right, just a few more slides to cover on this presentation dealing with privilege and oppression. So we left off talking a little bit about McIntosh's essay on white privilege entitled Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And we're just kind of questioning why is it that people with privilege may be willing to recognize that systems of inequality or oppression exist, but be very reluctant to acknowledge that they actually benefit in any way from the privileges that they have. And well, we looked at conflict theorists as an explanation towards that. Again, people with power often don't want to give up their power in society from a conflict theorist perspective, because having power affords you privileges, gives you benefits, gives you a head up or a leg up in society, which is definitely a good thing for people with privilege. But the flip side of that is that if there are certain people that are getting special opportunities or unearned benefits or advantages, that means that there's a counter group that is not getting those benefits. And that's where systems of oppression come into play. That's how people get marginalized in society. I really hope that you took the time to carefully read this essay. This is kind of internationally renowned as one of the most influential essays dealing with this topic of white privilege in connection to racism. And we're definitely going to take a much closer look at racism in the coming weeks as one of the biggest social problems that our society continues to face today. But beyond the specific content that it focuses on, this piece is a really great tool at helping us as individuals recognize the privileges that we possess in our everyday lives, right? It's not just privilege pertaining to skin color. It can be privilege pertaining to your gender, your sexuality, your religion, your nationality, your physical or mental ability, your socioeconomic status. There's so many different social structures and identities that we possess as humans that we experience privilege in that we take for granted. Which leads into this next point here. As a society, we are socialized to take our privileges for granted, to consider them the norm against which all other subsequent categories in that identity become othered or marginalized, right? So that's the big argument that McIntosh is making when she's writing this essay, that we're taught that whiteness is just something that we can take for granted, that it almost is just the default up against which all other races get compared. And since white is the privileged race in our society, it automatically gets special advantages, and anything that's non-white subsequently gets disadvantaged. She says, many, perhaps most of our white students in the United States think that racism doesn't affect them because they are not people of color. They do not see whiteness as a racial identity. This is really problematic, and it begs the question, who benefits when whiteness or any privileged group is taken for granted? Well, obviously, the privileged group serves to benefit from that. So what does that mean? Well, imagine if you're a white person, such as myself, every day I wake up, I never think about how the color of my skin could cause me a problem that day. I never think about that. I never have to, because my white skin has never caused me any problems. I've never worried about being pulled over by the police because of the color of my skin. When I go shopping, I never worry about being followed around by a sales worker in the store because of the color of my skin. When I go to buy Band-Aids, I never worry about being able to find a Band-Aid that matches my flesh tone. When I'm walking down the street, I don't worry that people are going to cross over to the other side of the street because of the color of my skin, because they're afraid that I might mug them. These are stereotypical racial problems that people of color face today, right? Racism still exists, and we're taught that as being white people with this privilege, we don't need to think about these things. People of color think about those things still, right? Maybe not every day. Maybe some of them, like I mentioned before, don't want to, and they're entitled to not have to deal with that mental baggage every day. But there's going to be instances where members of marginalized groups, not just racial minorities, but minorities in any one of these social structures or identities that we've talked about, have to constantly deal with this extra baggage, run into these extra barriers, overcome these extra obstacles because they have a marginalized identity that privileged people don't need to overcome, right? So it's really important to recognize this when we're talking about social problems, when we're talking about systems of oppression and inequalities and marginalization. It's not just a one-sided story. It's not just that there's a group of people and they're treated unfairly. We also equally, if not more so, need to recognize for every group that's treated unfairly, there's a group of people that gets treated exponentially better. So we need to recognize that this privilege and marginalization combination is really important at examining fully to understand the complexities of social problems. So the last few questions I'd like to bring up for your attention to hopefully have you think about pertain to Jane Elliott's video about the brown eye, blue eye exercise. And like I said, I saw this close to probably 15 years ago now when I was a high school student. And it was the first time in my life, because I'm white and I grew up in a predominantly white community, it was the first time I was ever challenged as a young adult to think critically about race and the role that my whiteness has in serving to further this system of oppression of racism in the United States. So as hopefully you recognize from watching the video, Jane Elliott developed this exercise where she divided students up into two different groups based off their eye color. So if they had brown eyes, they were in one group. Often that was the good group, the privileged group in this exercise. And if they had blue eyes or green eyes or hazel eyes or anything other than brown, they got put into the other group. And that blue eye group, more often than not, was labeled as the marginalized group. So her point in this exercise was to show people how differently we treat people of color in the United States based off of skin tone, when we could have just as easily constructed a system of privilege and oppression in our society based off of eye color. Right? Her argument is that it's the exact same chemical or hormone in the body that produces your eye pigmentation versus your skin pigmentation. But in our society, we decided that we were going to divide people up based off their skin color. We were going to establish this oppressive system of slavery based off of skin color, not eye color. And that resulted in how we treat people of color inferior to white people in the United States today. And this exercise got very controversial because a lot of people who either have never had to think about privilege and oppression before, or have only had to think about oppression and marginalization in smaller ways, got forced to think about how severely oppression, particularly racial oppression, impacts people of color in the United States today. And one of the most common arguments that Jane Elliott seems to get back from students that she's involved in this exercise is that everybody, virtually almost everyone, experiences discrimination or experiences marginalization in some way. Because remember, we talked about our identities, our social locations being multifaceted. So I experience, for example, privilege for being a man in society, but I am also experience marginalization because I'm a sexual minority. I'm part of the LGBT plus community, right? So I experience privilege in some regards to my identity, but I'm oppressed in other regards of my identity as well. So a lot of people say nobody's completely privileged or completely oppressed. So how dare you take away my oppression? A lot of people say, you don't know where I came from. You don't know what I've had to overcome to get to where I am today. And people get really upset about that. So why do you think that is? Why do you think people default to this defense mechanism to say, you don't know me, you don't know where I came from, you don't know what I've experienced, instead of owning the privilege that they have and really being critical and reflecting on how the advantages that they've had in society have maybe opened doors for them that have been closed for other people based off of something as simple as skin tone or your gender identity or your religion or your national identity, right? That's what she's trying to get us to think about. And that's what's really important to recognize with privilege and oppression, to recognize that racism and sexism and homophobia exist does not take away from any inequalities or oppression that you have personally experienced, right? We get into this kind of fight almost that some people call the oppression Olympics, where we say, oh, I'm more oppressed than you. I've gone through more things than you. Yeah, maybe you've experienced racism, but I've experienced sexism, blah, blah, blah. And that really takes away from the bigger message here. The thing that we're interested in sociology and understanding is how can we get to a point in society where all humans have equal opportunities, right? What policies need to be in place? What norms need to be changed? What social structures do we need to reconstruct to get to a point where everyone has equal access and equal opportunity to the same endeavors, regardless of their race or their sex or their skin or their religion, etc., right? And the big takeaway is that other big takeaway here is that sometimes we can be part of an oppressed or a marginalized community, but based off of how other people perceive us, we might not always experience discrimination because of it, right? So that's another thing to think about. Yeah, I'm part of the LGBT plus community. So if I'm being very open or out or blatant about my sexual identity as a sexual minority, I put myself at greater risk of being discriminated against. But if I put on a baseball cap and a sweatshirt and go to a sports bar to watch the Spurs play, I can blend in with heterosexual crowds pretty easily, and I don't necessarily need to worry about being discriminated against for being queer when I'm in that space, because people might not pick up on that, right? It's not so easy to do that if you're a person of color, right? It's not like a black person can just erase the color of their skin and blend in with white people just for a day, right? So that's really important to get at too. Not all types of marginalization and oppression are treated equally here, right? Some groups inherently experience more discrimination than others, and that's just a scientific fact. That's what the data shows us, and we're going to take a much closer look into a lot of specific social problems, a lot of specific systems of oppression in the remainder of the semester. And this I recognize is a really difficult topic to introduce, and it's very uncomfortable for most people, and rightfully so. It's a difficult topic to understand. It's a difficult topic to reflect on, but I really encourage all of you to lean into this discomfort, to lean into these uncomfortable self-reflections, to really take a close look and self-evaluate how you both experience privilege and perhaps have also experienced marginalization in your own life, and get comfortable leaning into these uncomfortable moments, because we're going to need to do that a lot in this course to really understand the causes of these social problems, and most importantly, to think effectively about what we can do to solve them.